mindsets influence the way we see the world, I also want to introduce a couple of tools, actually 3 tools, that we will use through the course of our session today to talk about some real client work that I've done in the past and give you the opportunity to apply those tools to those client contexts and see how they help you increase your understanding of complexity and systems dynamics. And after those 2 sessions, we'll wrap it all up with a little bit of Q&A. So I'm really looking forward to the next 90 minutes. Let's jump right in. We'll start with mindsets. Okay, next slide on mindsets. We're talking about the what, why, and the how to apply of just about everything today. So I'll start this conversation with systems thinking and say that what is systems thinking? It is a mindset. It is a mindset and our point of departure from which we explore and we analyze system components and their interactions. Why would we do this? Because mindsets help us illuminate the underlying conditions that produce the results we get, and they hold us back from getting the results that we want. So mindsets are really critical. They allow us to make the best choices. They allow us to figure out who we can influence, who those best actors might be. And best is in quotes here because it's not always possible to understand this. We need to maybe look at our mindset when we think conventionally about problems. So best isn't always possible to identify, and that has to do with our conventional mindset or conventional perspective. So we can move on to the next slide and investigate that just a little bit. So what is a conventional perspective? This perspective serves us when we're talking about simple systems like a key in a lock, or even a complicated system like a car, but it doesn't necessarily hold true when we think about complex systems, like us driving a car, navigating city traffic in rush hour when there's been an accident ahead. This is a complex system, and it's not necessarily something we can interrogate, investigate, and illuminate with a conventional perspective, because these conventional perspectives are closed. They're static, they're reductionist, they're usually linear. They often have a bias of being rational. They often overlook human biases and errors. They often centralize or center formal structures, and they articulate a belief in a clear cause and effect. Often what we see in complex systems is that those causes and effects aren't always so clear. So let's go for a moment and anchor ourselves in the next slide, which is our operational definition of a complex system. So this is a set of actors as well as interactions that form a coherent whole, perform a specific function, and has a boundary that sets it apart from the rest of the world. This is the definition we're going to work with when we talk about complex systems. And on the next slide, we're going to explore that from the perspective of what is a systems mindset. So here on our next slide, we see this systems perspective. This is open, it's interactive, it's nonlinear, it's driven by the reality that as human beings, we have bias and we make error. We also operate in many, many informal systems. And in complex systems and with a systems perspective, we can see that causes and effects are often emergent. And this means we can't know what's best from the start. And this has important implications for strategy making. I'm going to move to the next slide and talk a little bit about that. Now, I've done strategy with a conventional mindset, and I've done strategy with a systems mindset. And I'm here to tell you today that it's better when we all see the system. A systems mindset helps us see others' perspectives. It helps us empathize, and it helps us expose incentive structures that trigger action. System thinking allows us to zoom out and see the most influential levers of change across a large system. Systems approaches can give us a shared picture to help us prioritize leverage points that fit our capacity to intervene and also our strategy. So as a practitioner of systems thinking, systems mapping, systems approaches, and an owner of a systems mindset, I want to explore with you a few of the tools I use with clients to help get them there, to help us work collaboratively and across sectors to see the system. My next slide, I'm going to introduce the first of a set of tools that we'll be using in our breakout sessions today. And the first tool I want to introduce is this tool called an influence and incentive analysis. Now, what is it? It's an analytical tool that frames ability and motivation to change in systems terms. Now, why would we use it? Well, we'd use it to identify the stakeholders that can spark transformation. And how do we apply it? It's important with this tool and with many of the tools that I'm going to introduce today, if not all of them, that we use these tools iteratively. It's not a one and done situation. We won't have the answer and carve it in stone. We'll go back to it, we'll revise, we'll refresh, we'll learn more, we'll take another pass. So with incentives and influence analysis, remember to use this tool iteratively and first list and then locate important stakeholders on the matrix. On the next slide, we have an example of this matrix. It's a pretty simple one. I think most of our participants here are business school students, so introducing a 2x2 is probably not going to shock anyone. But what's important about this 2x2 is that influence rises and incentive increases as we go out to the right. So our stakeholders with the highest influence and incentive to change the system are those stakeholders who we plot in the top right quadrant of this matrix. We'll get an opportunity to use the influence and incentives analysis in just a second. But before we do, let's look at our next tool. The next tool is systems mapping. Now, Map the System is all about mapping the system. And my guess is that many of you have been exposed to tools like causal loop diagramming and other types of systems mapping that allow us to really get into the nitty-gritty of how a system works. I'm introducing systemogram today because it's a diagram that shows systems actors and resources and the interactions between them that contribute to the overall function. Thus, it shows the whole system based on our complex systems definition. But the reason I picked it is because it's a relatively intuitive way to illustrate the system at a point in time. And a systemogram, good and bad, is unburdened by the complex feedback loops that actually drive systemic outcomes. This is good because it allows us to map something simply and quickly. It's bad because we're missing part of the story when we don't understand these feedback loops, but it's a really good place to start. And as I mentioned with influence and incentives, all these tools are things we want to use iteratively. So a great exercise in systems mapping might begin with a quick and dirty systemogram with lots of stakeholders to make sure we have all the right resources and actors, and then dive deep into causal loop diagramming to make sure that we understand the dynamics. So how to apply? Get a shared understanding of the system with multiple stakeholders and multiple perspectives, and map out your early ideas on where to start to spark transformation. Then you want to test the systemogram with stakeholders. Excuse me, I apologize for the last days of this cold that won't leave me. But let's look at the next slide. And this is an illustration of a systemogram that I have used with clients in the past. It really maps a very simple system of smallholder farmers, agriculture in Africa, where I do most of my work. And it illustrates how agriculture in Africa employs farmers that are large scale and small scale. And in many cases, those small scale farmers aggregate their produce. They do that in farmer-based organizations and collection centers. And through these collection centers, they can often access credit and insurance. And that's important because it's required for purchasing the technologies, the storage, and the processing that they need to get their goods to market. So you can see how this simple systems diagram leverages natural language to communicate the reality of a system. And that's really essential at the beginning. We want to not be overwhelmed by the complexity of a mapping tool. We want to get something on paper so that we can share perspectives with other stakeholders who have an important role to play in the systems transformation we'd like to see. So this is an example systems diagram. We'll come back to this later in the session as well. But before that, let's introduce our third tool, which is leverage points. And leverage points identify areas of a system that are connected to other areas and have some recognizable characteristics. I'll talk about those characteristics in a second. But first, I want to say, why would we do this? Why would we want to identify leverage points within a system? Well, we want to do that because they're the places where a small change could lead to a really big shift in behavior. So we use this leverage points approach to focus strategy to leverage points to trigger systems transformation. On the next slide, what I'm going to do is just introduce a handful of leverage points. This isn't an exhaustive list, but I find it's a pretty inclusive one. And we'll talk about a few of these leverage points. So leverage points can be identified by bright spots in the system. This is places where positive change might already be happening. If we think about our global food system, which is a really big thing, big complex system to think about, we might think about bright spots like consumers who are showing a real increased interest in healthy food choices. That might be a bright spot in the system. We can also think about things like ripple effects. The recent conversation in climate change is bringing together some really important new science around the contribution of industrial agriculture to climate change. Industrial agriculture has ripple effects in our global food systems. And this is a place that may have great potential to affect many other factors and dynamics downstream. Another place we might think about is energy. So where is energy or investment happening to disrupt the status quo? Where are people trying to reorganize and cause new patterns? I think about vertical farming. I think about the increased interest from venture capitalists and others in crowding in on these new technologies that may give us breakthroughs in dimensions of urban farming and closer opportunities for farm to fork. There's also things that could be identified as a leverage point that may be considered kind of frozen. Things like the big food marketing lobbies and the way that the agriculture lobby works in Washington, D.C. I know I'm speaking to an international audience, but I think that U.S. lobbying in its nature is probably something that's known about the worldwide. Another place that we might find leverage within a system is something that looks like a bit of a mixed bag. It really could go either way. And if we play the right card at the right time, we may be able to tilt the system in the direction that we'd like to see it go. So I know that that was rapid. It was a lot to take in, but I wanted to get it all out there so that we could really dive in exercises and apply these tools in a real world context. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to jump to the next slide. I'm going to introduce a client. This is the Polaris, formerly known as the Polaris Project. This is an organization based in Washington, D.C. that operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline and also does a lot of other programming to address human trafficking in all of its forms. I'm going to ask to move to the next slide as a kicker to introduce Polaris from a film that the organization produced in 2015. Now, this is before I had the opportunity to work with Polaris, but I think it gives you a really good snapshot of what their stakeholder landscape and strategic agenda looked like in 2015. Could we go ahead and play that video? I don't hear audio. I don't know if anyone else does. Great. Thank you. Thanks for playing that, Melissa. And I'm glad we got the audio there. You saw the dramatic situation, the real world reality of human trafficking, and the way that this particular organization chose to communicate about it in 2015. And in that, they illuminated some of the work that they're doing, and they gave some statistics, and they framed the issue. What we're going to do now is to move on to the next slide, slide number 18, which will talk to us about how we're going to break out into groups and really take apart what we've just seen and understand it from a systems perspective. We have some folks who are in the room. We have some folks who are on Zoom. We're going to break into groups. We're going to do a short exercise, and this exercise is going to use the influence and incentive analysis tool that I introduced just a few minutes ago. We're going to list 5 stakeholders, and we're going to map them against the matrix. You'll do this for about 10 minutes in your breakout group, and then we'll come back into the main plenary room and with the folks who are physically in the room, and we'll discuss what you found and what stakeholders ended up being placed where on your matrix. So a list of 5 stakeholders that you saw in the video or that you imagine are probably part of this system, and map them on the matrix based on their influence and incentive to change anything about the system and the way it works now. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I see the room filling up. I hope that that exercise was useful, fruitful. I'd love to hear from some folks about how they found that. Is there a group who would like to share? Anybody maybe in the room who got the chance to work collaboratively with live humans?
Okay. Oh yeah, we got one right here, ready to share.
All right.
All right. So can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So on our, do I share my screen or like, do I just,
We see you. Thank you, Princess.
incentive would actually be high. Sorry, this is in reverse order. So high incentive and low influence. And then customers, it's actually reversed with the victims aspect of it. It should be also low influence, but also low incentive. So just ignore the order of that. It's supposed to be switched. And then we also have the family and friends of the victims as another stakeholder. So there's 2 sides of this. There could be people, Busola mentioned that there are people that may want they knowingly put their family member or friend into this situation so that they could get an incentive. And she brought up some examples that she knows of. And then there's also those, of course, who are trying to get their family and friends back from that system, from that issue. So they could be anywhere in the middle, depending on who you are. The judicial system, we went back and forth with this one. We said that their incentive is kind of in the middle, but their influence is high. So incentive in the middle, just because there's a lot of resources they have to go through towards that. It's a very complex problem. So until usually activists actually make a noise to say, hey, can you help us or help these victims, and they don't necessarily act all the time. Then we have activists saying that they have high incentive and mid influence, depending on like how many people they can gather around this issue. Traffickers, high incentive and high influence. Low incentive and high influence. Sorry for this. It's it got a little all over the place, but essentially they don't have the incentives to change the system because it's a system that they created. But they do have a lot of influence towards it. Like if someone reforms themselves and becomes an informant, for example. So yeah.
Great, you guys got some really rich stakeholders. Anybody else got somebody specifically? Let's focus on the top right-hand quadrant where we're identifying stakeholders that have really high influence and really high incentive. Who's in that box for maybe another group or 2? can throw it in the chat. You can raise hands.
Our group, hi, sorry, can I chime in?
Yeah.
Our group put, we were looking at the energy infusion kind of aspect, and we were looking at, there's some sort of faceless rich people supporting this. They're infusing the system with money. Like we were kind of seeing the traffickers as being in the high incentive but low influence area, because they're kind of like a middleman moving like quote unquote product, but they're not the people backing it monetarily. So that's kind of what we were talking about when we met.
Okay, that's great. I saw Joe's hand, and I'm gonna ask Joe to contribute. Anything on the top right hand there, Joe?
I think it's more of a question.
Okay.
I didn't really understand where do families of the victim stand in this matter?
That's up to you. How do you feel about their influence and incentive to change? I imagine their incentive to change the system is probably high, but maybe they have low influence.
Yeah, I thought too, but in the same time they could maybe create association, and because they are so close to the problem, they can have a really high influence in changing it, because they are families of the victim, because they have seen firsthand what are the damages of such operations. And so they have a lot of credibility. And I think also we can consider that their influence is pretty high. I was a bit lost during the exercise. Where can I put them?
Let's go with that for a second. I see Alice has already got the next slide up. So let's go ahead and talk about what's on that next slide, which is specifically what we can do with this analysis. So influence and incentive analysis allows us to isolate groups of stakeholders and figure out how to work with them. I was asking about the top right-hand side because that's the group that I would propose you engage most closely with. That's the group that has the most incentive and the most influence. These stakeholders are hoping for the same change that you wish to see in the system, and they're going to be your biggest allies. So you want to collaborate with them, you want to work with them in a really complementary manner, and you want to pull them in. Oftentimes though, these are not the beneficiaries of the change that you want to see in the system, and that's because those folks very often don't have the level of influence we might hope. This system of human trafficking is abusive. It exploits human beings, and it feeds on and runs because the people most devastated by this system have little influence. So the families of traffic victims often don't have much influence. They really understand the problem, but they're not making the laws, they're not running the police organizations, they're not able to crack down on this issue because they have low power in this system. So these are folks we want to keep informed. We want them to know about what we're doing, but we have to recognize that part of the reason that they're victims in this situation or in this framing is that their power isn't very high. They have relatively low influence. So those folks are on the bottom right. We've got to keep them informed. But we want to engage closely with those on the top right, those with lots of influence and a lot of incentives. And with those on the top left, with a lot of influence but not much incentive to change, these are the folks we want to start to align our goals with their goals. How can we work together? You may not see this as a big deal, but I'm here to tell you that it is. How can we align our goals so that our efforts go in the same direction, right? So engage closely with those with lots of influence and incentive. Align goals with lots of influence, but not much incentive to see the change. And keep those who are on the receiving end or the victim side here informed so that you're really close and proximate to the problem and understand it fully. So what I'm going to do next is ask that we see one more video. I introduced you to Polaris when in 2015. That was before we had the chance to work together to establish a systems practice within the organization. And I want to show a video from 2021. which speaks a little bit about where the organization is now and how it sees the problems and the stakeholders and the solutions in the system of human trafficking. So let's jump to the next slide and the next video and get up to speed on Polaris.
There are 25 million people around the world living under the control of human traffickers, and that number is only going to grow unless something changes. Arresting traffickers will not by itself end human trafficking. There's too much out there, and it's too complex. To fundamentally reduce the amount of trafficking, we have to change the conditions that make trafficking possible in the first place. Traffickers pinpoint what people need and pretend to give it to them. Maybe it's a job or an apartment. Maybe it's love or a sense of belonging. Traffickers target communities where the needs are greatest, communities struggling with poverty, addiction, and trauma. To disarm the traffickers, we have to create a world where those needs are met by someone other than the trafficker. That means fixing the broken systems that fail to meet those needs: foster care, housing, worker protections, education, criminal justice, to name a few. But it also means going deeper. Preventing trafficking means facing the fallout of racism, sexism, and discrimination. It means repairing the damage done by unjust and unequal policies and practices that have, over generations, led to greater needs in some communities than others. We are strengthening communities, changing norms and attitudes, and putting power in the hands of workers and vulnerable people. We are building a social justice movement to end human trafficking.
I want to clap for that. I'm really proud of the progress that Polaris has made in understanding and framing their issue. Anything surprising in what you saw there? Just maybe popcorn that into the chat or raise a hand, or any thoughts, any reactions? What's the difference in these two organizations, Polaris of 2015 and Polaris of 2021? Collective effort. Activities are indirect but make sense. Yeah, why it exists, getting to that root cause. I loved their articulation that they were going after the conditions that keep the system in place. And that, I think, is really the central tenet here, is how can we address the conditions that keep the system in place? And this need for love, belonging, human connection, and when the structures that provide that fracture and fail, we get vulnerability. When we get vulnerability, we get trafficking. And so that's an angle into this complex problem that wasn't on the table before, when we were only talking about victims and massage parlors and police. Now we're talking about something that's far more holistic and really more rich. So it's very interesting to think about how these complex problems and organizations that aim to change them can think about stakeholders and where they have influence and incentive and work with and through those stakeholders to affect change in the systems of interest. So that's Polaris. Thanks for going on that journey with me from about a 6-year span of an organizational mindset as it shifted from being fairly traditional to being fairly systems oriented. It's pretty exciting. I want to bring you to another client that I worked with more recently that Melissa was actually part of my team on when we helped GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to watch a video, get introduced to GAIN. And this particular situation, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition was working on the ground in Kebbi State in Nigeria. And we're going to watch a quick video to understand the informal marketplace in which residents of Kebbi State access the food that they eat in their homes every day. So let's go ahead, watch that video, meet some folks like Musa and Felicia, I believe, are the characters that we have here, and some really great, rich cinematography from Pierce Mill on Kebbi State.
It's morning at this Nigerian market, a traditional market like many seen around the world, serving both rural and urban consumers. People will come from miles around to do their daily shopping, assuming that what they will buy for their families is safe to eat.
My name is Felicia Danlami. I go to the market to buy the food. How many children do I have? I have 4 of them. The food I make for them, that it make them sick, is my mind. They was going to toilets every time. That is why I don't cook that food in my house, because I don't want to experience that thing again.
Sunan da na maimaita da kaina kamar na farko dai sunana da na baku Alhaji Musa Bebeji. Ina sai da cabbage, green pepper, green beans, carrot, cucumber, beetroot, radish, mint leaf, parsley, celery, spring onions. Wannan kayan da na fara siyarwa na kai shekara 7 kenan ina sai da wannan kaya.
The vendors here are entrepreneurial, resilient, and hustle each day to show off their wares. It's important to their livelihoods that the food they sell is safe.
Mun je kasuwar Talata market. Akwai kayan da na siya sai da na je kasuwa ma na juye shi sai na ga ya ruba da yawa sai na samu yara na ce to su tsince duk wani ya ruban.
Food safety, nutrition, and food security are all bound together. Around the world, markets like this provide access to highly nutritious but perishable foods. But foodborne illness can jeopardize it all. The impact of our public health, nutrition, and agricultural investments, the livelihood of vendors, and most critically, the health of our children.
I buy many things for my children. When I buy the food, this thing that they love to eat.
Masu saya min kaya suna da muhimmanci sosai game da ni saboda duk mutumin da ya san mutuncin kasuwa ya rike kwastoma sosai.
They like to help me with the food. She help me to peel the mangi and pound the pepper for me. She always be there when anytime that I want to cook the food. She help me a lot. She said, "Mommy, I want to test the food, because I know that the food is okay." She said, "Mommy, your food is good." I will tell her, "Okay, thank you. When you grow, this is how you'll be cooking for me." She said, "Okay, Mommy, I'll cook the food for you."
Traditional markets play critical roles in feeding and nourishing the world. They can and should always be a hub of safe, nutritious food. USAID is investing in food safety research, working with governments, supply chains, vendors, and consumers to help make every bite as safe and nutritious as it can be.
Great. So that was Kebbi State, Nigeria, an informal food market where Melissa and I and a team from Food Systems Foresight partnered with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition to develop new interventions around food safety. And the first thing that we did in that process was use a systemogram to get everyone aligned on what was the system that we were seeing. And so what I'm going to do today is offer you a peek at an excerpt of that systemogram. So we're going to, again, break into groups. We're going to navigate our way to our group's a set of slides. And in those slides, you'll find a narrative excerpt, which is just a bunch of words that describe your systemogram, and a picture of your systemogram. We're going to ask you to read the narrative and review the diagram, and then review the leverage points. That was the second or the third tool that we talked about earlier. There's a slide in there with those leverage points. Reflect on what's there, reflect on what you heard and saw in the video, and pick a leverage point and articulate which point you're picking, what kind it is. So I'm picking consumers because I think consumers are where the energy is at, and here's why I believe that. What did you see in the video? What do you understand about the nature of consumer choice in informal markets? Note your why. Pick a leverage point, label it, and note your why. You'll have 15 minutes for this exercise because the diagram's a little bit more complicated. There's some reading to do. We'll send you off into our groups, and then we'll come back and we'll unpack this exercise in plenary. So with that, let's go ahead and go into our breakout rooms. I want to just refresh on the leverage points, because that was the point of the exercise. We were looking for leverage in this system. We were looking for bright spots, places where we might have ripple effect, a situation where something might be frozen and we might be just the incentive to melt it, or a place where there's already energy, or a mixed bag. It could go either way, but what happens if we push here? These are the kinds of leverage points that we're looking for. Places in the system that have a lot of connections. Like when we saw in the previous systemogram, we saw that our insurance and access to finance was a really connected node in the map. What were the connected nodes we saw in the food safety map? So let's take a minute and move down to the systemogram on the next slide. This is what you were all working with, a small segment of what is really quite a complex picture that tries to tease out the tensions between food price and quality, choices that we make as consumers, offerings that we make as vendors, and ultimately how we collect ourselves in markets. This is a systemogram that we worked with GAIN this past summer, and I'd love to hear how you all found it, how you all came to understand it, and where you all believed you might find leverage within this system. So let's do this. I'd love to hear, did anybody find a leverage point where they thought that there was a significant amount of energy? Anybody pick energy, and can they tell me where they thought that they saw that in the system? You can pop it in the chat, you can raise your hand. We're all friends here, you can come off mute and shout it out.
We thought the market could be an energetic leverage point between the vendors and the suppliers and the vendors.
Yes, yes, absolutely. The market is nothing but full of energy. If you've ever been in one of these markets, that's what they all are about. They're a buzz. They're a buzz. So markets, yeah, definitely a place to achieve leverage through energy. Someone's put in the chat food and money. Can you say more about food and money? What kinds of leverage points are food and money for you?
Yeah, okay, so I would say energy, because it's what gets people to the market is either to make money or to go get food. Yeah.
Yeah,
so I would say they're
absolutely.
energy.
Yeah, this is what our big drive is. What about some of the other leverage points? Did anybody discover what they thought might have been, say, a ripple effect, a mixed bag? Precious, I see your hand, and you can go ahead and speak. And it doesn't matter if you're speaking about mixed bag or not.
Hi, everyone. I just want to substantiate on Cynthia's point where she raised the issue of food and money.
Yes.
So we can look at this across different countries. It can be in the African continent, Asian continent. So we have to put into consideration some of the structural violence factors that are in play. For example, we have to look at poverty. Poverty is the massive drive, and not everybody has got the access to these resources. So there are so many dynamics that are at play that we need to consider first before we get to a greater extent. So I just wanted to substantiate on Cynthia's point.
That's excellent. Thank you very much for that. And it's absolutely true. And when we were working with our clients to identify places of intervention, we considered that very, very closely. Poverty and gender inequality, these are really important factors that are 100% at play in these markets every single day. Some women are not allowed to be vendors. Some women are not allowed to buy food or other goods from male vendors. Religion is a big influence in this marketplace. About half of the folks in this market are Muslim and about half of them are Christian. What does that mean for the way that we buy and sell food? It's important to consider many of these factors: poverty, the influence of religion and other structures. Norms around gender are extremely important. I like this point here, energy around the mother sharing her knowledge with her daughter. That's an excellent point. And one of those perhaps, subtle or maybe even counterintuitive places where we can have an incredible amount of impact. The bond between a mother and daughter around the preparation of food is an incredibly important bond, and it's one that stays with a person for life. So if we can change that conversation between mother and daughter from one that's exclusively about how to make the food and get it on the table in time to how to make the food in a safe way, how to prevent the mai from causing foodborne illness, as Felicia talked about how it had previously in her home, we might be able to address food safety right from the household perspective. And so that's a really interesting place to look. Innocent, I see your hand.
Okay, so for us, we had 2 points that we managed to identify. I think we identified a ripple effect. I think we were saying, we noted that most of the diseases that were being quoted to be happening were caused by the interaction of maybe livestock products and then the fresh farm produce. And what we identified, which could be a leverage point, would be the link between the reputation of the vendor and also the diseases. So we had within the video that the vendor was saying they would really like not to have a case whereby customers associate them with a particular disease-causing produce. So we thought that if we could get to tap into this belief that is held by the vendor, and the vendor would actually increase would actually separate, in essence, their farm produce and the livestock produce, primarily before even selling it, we could get to a point whereby this affects other corresponding parts of the system and eventually maybe progress towards a better sustained system. So I think that was one part of it. And the other part that we talked about was the bright spot. We saw how the mother was talking about taking deliberate action to ensure the quality of the food that she buys for her family, quoting her experience which she had with her children. And she was saying, now I make sure that I take a look and see how the produce actually is. And we think if we would actually tap into this innate characteristic that we're now finding within the type of a customer exemplified by this mother, then we might actually have a bright spot within the system, which might, in essence, illuminate the whole system at some point in time.
That's awesome. Thank you, Inessa. You touch on something that's really important, and it's something that our client also elevated as a really, really high on their list of places to intervene, and that's with vendor reputation. This is a really important point, and ultimately vendors, build long-term relationships with their clients. They may be informal, but these relationships are fundamental to their success, and sickness really hurts those relationships. So finding ways to motivate vendors to defend their reputation with their clients and consumers is really, really important. I also saw another important ripple effect here in the chat: consumer demand. Motivating consumers to demand safe food is the fundamental mission of the Eat Safe project, which is the project that created the video and the project that we worked on with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, funded by USAID. So ultimately, the goal here of this program was to put the power in the hands of the consumer so that the consumer would demand safe food, which would then change vendor behavior to ensure the safety of the food, creating really a market-oriented systemic intervention. You touched on some other sociocultural norms, which are definitely well articulated as a frozen point, and that requires special consideration and special types of intervention. We always want to be really proximate to any of these situations if we try to intervene. The worst case scenario is trying to intervene in a sociocultural norm from afar or without appropriate context or understanding of that. So when we work in systems like this, we try to make sure that we are using principles not only of systems thinking, but also principles coming from areas like human-centered design. How can we really hear these users? How can we test directly with them what might work and what might not? And that, I think, is a really important takeaway from this exercise. Okay, folks, we are at that point where what I'd like to do is sum up this discussion on GAIN. And so with that, I'll conclude on the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition and the work that we did to help them advance food safety in informal markets in Nigeria. And I'd like to summarize what we did today in this workshop, which has been incredibly exciting for me. It's been a great privilege to speak with all of you and hear your questions. And we've got a little bit more time to do that. I want to just recap. Today, what we did was cover mental models for systems thinking and how those can inform strategy. We used 2 real-life cases to test drive 3 strategic tools. So we used influence and incentive analysis. That was our 2x2 that we put up right at the start. We used systemograms and we used leverage points. These 3 tools are really going to be applicable to your work in Map the System because they can help you, if used iteratively, to get to a better shared understanding, to really question the mental model you're using, to evaluate the system and to understand it, and to start to characterize and categorize the different stakeholders that you see in this system. Who has the incentive to make the change? Who has the influence? You want to think about your stakeholders in that way so you can think about how you might intervene and find good leverage points that fit not just the system, but also your capabilities and your strategy if you're working within an organization that has one. So that's my summary. I'm going to open the floor to any questions. It's really been my pleasure. I've enjoyed this so much.
Yeah, thank you. If someone has a question, please raise your hand, interrupt. But thank you sincerely, Angela, for this amazing presentation. Any opportunity I get to work near you or with you is always wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, on behalf of Saeed, on all the students in the room, and thank you to everyone who engaged. Good luck with everyone involved in Map the System. This is just the start of a really exciting and interesting year for you.